The Mass is a great call and response between Christ the head and his mystical body. As Christians, we are called to relationship with Jesus. There is no more intense, privileged way to relate to him than at the Mass. It's the great prayer, the supreme form of adoration, the ultimate form of play, the way by which we encounter the living God. It's a mystery that puts us into contact with the divine reality. The Mass is not a lecture or a performance that we witness from a distance. That is why we are called to full, active, conscious participation in the Mass. Well, one of the great clarion calls of Vatican II was for all of us fully, consciously, and actively to participate in the Mass. Vatican II also said that the liturgy is the source and the summit of the Christian life. It put a huge premium on the Mass. It wanted more and more of us to be more fully participating in this great prayer. Just recently, I was reading something by a hero of mine, Monsignor Reinhold Hillenbrand, who was a leader in the liturgical movement in the last century. He was giving a talk around the year 1960, and he was bemoaning the fact that only 50 to 60% of Catholics were attending Mass on Sunday. Only 50 to 60%. You know what the figure is now? In the West, in our country, it's maybe 20, 25%. Go to other parts in Europe and Australia, it gets down to 10%, 15%. If you had told the Fathers of Vatican II that in the year 2017, that would be the level of participation in the Mass, Vatican II wants us fully involved and fully understanding, fully participating in the liturgy. But I think, first of all, many have fallen away from it. But secondly, even a lot of Catholics who do come to Mass, I'm increasingly convinced, don't fully appreciate what it is they're participating in. So, my talks today are all about the Mass. In many ways, it's my favorite topic because as a priest, I'm a man of the Mass. When I was rector at Mundelein Seminary outside Chicago, I used to tell the students all the time, you're preparing to become men of the Mass. All that you do comes from the Mass, returns to the Mass, finds its life and energy in the Mass. So it's my favorite topic, and I think if Vatican II is right, it should be the favorite topic of everybody in the Church. Let me begin by invoking a friend of mine, Father John Muir. He's a priest in the Phoenix Diocese, and John was a former student of mine at Mundelein. And John is the best amateur golfer I know. He golfs like 72, 73. And for about 5 years, the week after Christmas, I would go to Phoenix to play golf with John for a week. Well, like all great golfers, he's a terrific putter, right? So one day we're walking up the fairway, and I said to him, John, give me a little help here with reading greens. How do you read a green so well? And he said, well, first look at the mountains. And I just laugh at the mountains. He goes, yeah, putts tend to break away from a mountain. Then he said, read your way in from the mountain till you get to the green, then we'll start reading the green. And I always think of John when I'm approaching a big topic like the Mass. I think first we have to get the big picture. We got to look at the mountains first. So in this first talk, that's what I'll do. I'll talk about some basic themes around the Mass. But then we're going to move in, and we're going to get to the green. We're going to read the green carefully. In the next 5 talks, I'll kind of walk through all the elements of the Mass. So first, the big picture, the mountains. Here's the first general theme I want you to know about the Mass. The Mass is a great encounter with Jesus Christ. In fact, it's the privileged encounter with Jesus Christ. So Christianity is not a philosophy primarily. It's not a moral system primarily, not a sociology, not an ideology. Christianity is a relationship to a person. It's a relationship with this Jesus. And we can relate to the Lord in all sorts of ways, but there is no more intense, no more privileged way to relate to him than at the Mass. Think for a second of the two major divisions of the Mass. So we have the liturgy of the Word and then the liturgy of the Eucharist, right? Well, they correspond precisely to the ways we usually relate to friends when they come over. Right? When someone comes over to visit, typically we talk for a while. No one comes to the door and says, here's dinner. No, first we sit down and we talk. We share stories, experiences, etc. And then typically we move into sharing a meal. So with Christ. At the Mass, we encounter him in person. And first we visit, we talk. He speaks to us. We speak back to him. And I'll say much more about this now in the ensuing talks. And then after we visit, we sit down for a meal. Not an ordinary meal, but one at which Christ himself is the host, at which his own body and blood are served. There is no more intense encounter with him possible than the Mass. Now, can you see why the Vatican II Fathers said this is the source and summit of the Christian life, and why, everybody, it's so tragic that 75% of our own brothers and sisters in the Catholic faith regularly stay away from the Mass. Oh, Jesus Christ, he's the center of my life. Jesus Christ is what it's all about. And yet, I regularly stay away from the privileged encounter with him. See, that's the problem we're facing. Here's a second general remark about the Mass. The Mass is the great mystery. You know, at the beginning of the Mass, the priest will say, let's prepare ourselves to celebrate these sacred mysteries. That lovely word, mysterion in Greek, mysterium in Latin, mystery. What's a mystery? Here's a definition from a friend of mine and one of the great experts in the liturgy, Abbot Jeremy Driscoll. He's the abbot up at Mount Angel in Oregon. Here's his pithy definition of a mystery. It's a concrete something that when you bump into it, it puts you in contact with a divine reality. That's a cool little pithy definition. A mystery, a mysterion, is a concrete something that you bump into and it puts you into contact with a divine reality. Do you see how the Mass in its entirety is a set of mysteries? From the procession of the ministers, to the candles, to the incense, to the proclamation of the word, to the transfigured elements of bread and wine, to the blessing offered by the priest or the bishop, all of it is a great mysterion, a concrete physical something that we encounter that gives us access to the divine reality. In the course of the talks this morning now, I'm going to be telling you all about these mysteries and how they open us up to the divine. Here's a third general idea about the Mass. And here I'm taking a lead from Romano Guardini. I don't know if you know that name. Romano Guardini, despite his very Italian name, was a German-born and German-writing theologian in the last century. Very influential upon John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Pope Francis. In fact, Pope Francis went to Europe to do doctoral work, and he wanted to write a major paper on Romano Guardini. And just very recently, by the way, they were proposing the beatification of this great figure. So here's an idea from Guardini. He says, the liturgy, the Mass, is the supreme form of play. What? Play? Seems counterintuitive. I thought the Mass is the most serious thing we can possibly do. Well, that's the point. See, we tend to get it precisely backward. We think work is what's most important. Work is serious stuff for serious people. Play is kind of trivial, it's superficial, it's unimportant. It's precisely backward. Work is that activity which is subordinate to an end beyond itself, right? So I work on my car that I might get it to run so I can go places and do things I want to do. I go to work so I can make money and do things that I really want to do. Work is for the sake of something else. Play, on the other hand, play is done entirely for its own sake. Play has no purpose outside of itself. Therefore, it's higher than work. It's more beautiful, it's more precious than work. You know, in this very church, just a couple weeks ago, there was a gathering of the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre. And I'm a proud member of that group. And this was the Mass for the installation of new members. And we're right in this church, it's filled up like it is today. And boy, the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre, they know how to dress for their ceremonies. The men are in these long capes emblazoned with the Jerusalem cross. They have these kind of jaunty berets on. The women are in long black gowns and mantillas. Well, there were all kinds of priests and bishops up here, all in, mass vestments, bishops with the tall mitres. And then for the installation itself, the bishops came down wearing mitres, and they took these great swords out, and they dubbed the people as they were received. Well, I was sitting right over here, and I remember thinking, what a wonderful form of play this is, And we're all doing what kids do when they play. We're dressing up. Now, see, I'm saying it this way on purpose, just to make the point. As Chesterton observed, children always know how to engage in serious play. See, kids know instinctually play is the more serious thing. And we tend to knock that out of them. We convince them, oh, no, work is what's more important. Be real practical. No, kids understand play is the most serious. And we tend to dress up when we play. So think of the Mass now as the supreme form of play. It's the most useless thing we can do. And by that I mean it's the highest thing we can do. When I used to teach philosophy at the seminary years ago, and I was introducing students to this arcane discipline of philosophy, I would use that line. I'd say, gentlemen, we're about to engage in the most useless study that we can. And they would do just what you did. They would laugh, and I'd say, no, I mean that is the highest praise. That's why, for example, we refer to philosophy as one of the liberal arts, just like literature and so on. Liberal, well, liber in Latin means free, right? What are they free from? They're free from utility. They're free from practicality. They're done for their own sake, like watching a baseball game, like engaging in a philosophical conversation. Those are forms of play. The Mass is the supreme form of play. By the way, it's what we will do forever in heaven. Now, I know, if you've been to some bad liturgies, that can be a little depressing, So I get that. But see, in principle, that's what heaven is. It's a place of utter uselessness because we'll be in the presence of the supreme good. Mass, in its playful uselessness, is a great anticipation of heaven. Here's a fourth general theme. The Mass is the supreme moment of worship. And brothers and sisters, this is such an important point, I think. I think it's one of the best ways to read the whole Bible. The Bible is about right and wrong forms of worship. Now, here's what I mean. Go back to the very beginning of the Bible. Go back to the book of Genesis. As God brings forth creation in that beautiful poetic text, let there be light, and there was light. And let the earth be formed, and so it was. And let the earth be filled with animals and plants of every kind, and let it be filled with things that crawl upon the earth, right? And then evening came, morning followed the first day. Evening came, morning followed the second day. Notice, please, this stately procession of elements coming forth from God. What does that remind you of? See, we Catholics are kind of clued into that. It's a bit like a liturgy, isn't it? Like a liturgical procession, the elements coming forth. Now, very important. What shouldn't we do with these things? Now think of sun and moon and planet, the earth, the mountains, animals. We shouldn't worship them, right? And in the ancient world, at one time or another, all those things were worshiped. The author of Genesis is saying, don't worship them. They're creatures. But, precisely because they come forth in this orderly liturgical way, we understand their purpose. They are meant to turn toward the Creator in right praise. Now, who comes at the end of a liturgical procession? The one who will lead the praise, right? So all the ministers come in. Imagine with the servers and the ministers and the lector and the incense bearer and so on, all coming forth. Who comes at the end but the priest or the bishop who will lead the praise? Who comes at the end of the great procession of creation but human beings? Now we get it. Now we get it. Our whole purpose is to be the priests, if you want, of creation, leading all of creation in a great chorus of praise to the Creator God. In that act of adoration, we realize who we are meant to be. We realize our deepest identity. And that word I love, by the way, adoration. Mass is the supreme moment of adoration. Ad ora in Latin. Ora means mouth, doesn't it? Ad ora, to the mouth of. When you adore, you are mouth to mouth with God. It means you're aligned unto God. So here we are, aligned unto God, consciously worshiping Him and leading a whole chorus of praise of all creation. That's the biblical vision of the good life, of the rightly ordered life. Where's trouble come? Fellow sinners. So we all know this story. Trouble comes from bad praise. And I challenge you, go through the whole Bible. I challenge you to find an exception to that. When Israel goes off kilter, it's because of bad praise. Worshiping not the Creator, but the creature. Whether it's idols, whether it's political powers, whether it's your own culture, whether it's the king, whatever. When you worship, and that word's lovely too, by the way. Worship in English is from an older English word, worthship. What's of highest worth to you? See, that's the question. Paul Tillich said that, the great Protestant theologian. He said, all you need to know about a person you can learn by asking one question. What do you worship? And very penetrating insight. All you need to know about a person you can learn by asking one question. What do you worship? Because what's of highest value to you will now become the ordering principle of your whole life, right? Human beings are meant to worship God. And in that process, draw all of creation into this great chorus of praise. Now, the Mass. And I'll talk about it in much more detail as we go. But the Mass is the moment when we are most ourselves. Because we've gathered in adoration, ad ora, mouth to mouth, worshiping, giving highest praise to God. And that's why there's a cosmic element to every Mass. Read Joseph Ratzinger on this. Over and over again, he stresses the cosmic dimension of the Mass. That's why if you go to the great Gothic cathedrals, you'll find they're covered inside and out with symbols of nature, of planets and animals and the stars. Right. As we give right praise to God, we're leading all of creation to a great chorus of praise. That's what's happening at Mass. And that's why at Mass, we are most ourselves. Now, listen, this is happening at 6:30 Mass on Tuesday morning, right? All this grand language, but that's the wonder of it. As even 10 people gather 6:30 Mass on a Tuesday morning, that's what's happening. I love that line from Thomas Merton when he went to the Abbey of Gethsemane as a young man, just to go on retreat. And he's being drawn into the Catholic world. But he did that retreat there, and then he wrote afterwards, "I found the still point around which the whole country revolves without knowing it." Beautiful. See, what he had found was the liturgy. He'd found the Mass. Adoration, right praise. Here's something, and I'll say more about it as we go, too. The link to heaven. Do you know there's a song, and I'm not bad-mouthing the music of it, but the lyrics I don't like. It's a song that says, "It's not in some heaven light years away, but here in this place is where we gather." I don't know if you know what I'm talking about. Gather us in, here we are, and not in some heaven light years away. Well, first of all, heaven isn't light years away. That's like Jupiter or something. Heaven's not like physically. Heaven, in fact, is closer to us than we are to ourselves, right? But the point is, it's precisely in heaven that we are when we gather for Mass. Why? Because our praise here below is meant to participate in and echo the eternal praise of the saints and angels in heaven. May our voices be one with theirs, we say later in the Mass, right? At the Holy, Holy. Well, who are we talking about there? But the angels. See, gathered in adoration, rightly ordered, may our praise here below echo and participate in theirs. The Mass lifts us up to heaven. And again, I'll say more about it as we go. It's so important, and this is Vatican II was so insistent upon this, that the Mass is not like a lecture or a performance, right? That we come to witness from a distance. It's this great prayer by which we are rightly ordered unto God. There's your full, conscious, and active participation in it. How about just one more general idea? The Mass is a great call and response between Christ the head and the members of his mystical body. Let me just say that again, because I'll come back to this theme a lot. The Mass is a great call and response between Christ the head and the members of his mystical body. Read the great Song of Songs in the Old Testament, which is a beautiful love poem. It's like two kids in love. And they spend the whole poem calling out to each other. Well, of course, the mystics of our tradition have seen that as a symbol of our love affair with God. So think of the Mass now as not just something set up here that I guess we respond to it. What's said up here, what's said by the priest or the bishop, is meant to be the call of Christ. Our response is the response of his mystical body, so that we come together. See, we're most ourselves, watch now, when we are gathered together as members of his mystical body, ordered to God in right praise. Does that make sense? And the Mass is what affects that. The Mass is what affects that moment, which is why it's the source and summit of the Christian life, and why we're meant fully, consciously, and actively to participate in it.